Fresh off of tax day, we are talking taxes with Jason Stein from the Wisconsin Policy Forum. Thanks so much for joining us here today.
My pleasure.
All right, so we're talking about some dueling tax plans, and you did some research into those two tax plans, one from Governor Evers, the other one was a flat tax proposal from Senator Devin LeMahieu. Can you kind of just lay out what each of those tax plans was?
Absolutely. So Senator LeMahieu's plan is essentially a flat tax of 3.25%. Right now, our tax rates range from a little over 3.5 all the way up to 7.65. Depending on the income level. That's going to go simply down to 3.25 under that plan. Under the Evers plan, it has many provisions, but the main one is a 10% tax credit for married couples up to $150,000 of income, and then it starts to phase out.
So let's talk about what income groups with each of these plans is going to get an actual cut, and in some cases maybe even boost their taxes a little bit.
Exactly. So, under the Republican plan, anyone who has a tax liability now would see a decrease. If you have no tax liability right now, you would not receive a decrease or more favorable treatment. The biggest one, obviously, though, is going to be for people at the upper end because they're going to have more than a 4 percentage point cut in the tax rate that applies to their upper income level. And that, for filers with $1 million or more of state adjusted gross income, you could see more than $100,000 tax cut on average for that group. Obviously going to be much smaller at the lower end. Under the Evers plan, it also concentrates its biggest impact on people at the upper end, but for those taxpayers, they're going to see, on average, a tax increase because Evers, again, would actually increase taxes both for capital gains, certain filers, and for manufacturers.
When you look at overarchingly, who does this benefit the most? You just mentioned with the Evers plan, clearly it doesn't benefit the high earners. So it's geared more towards those other income classes, correct?
Correct. Yeah, there may be in certain limited cases people that benefit at the upper end of the Evers plan, but by and large, they're going to see higher taxes people at the very high end. Under the Republican plan, again, anyone with a tax liability would see a cut, but people at the low end, could be very, very modest. Whereas, uniformly, people on the upper end are going to see quite substantial decreases.
And it's not surprising that Republicans are doing this because they've complained for a long time about the marginal tax rate at the top. Can you explain how that rate in Wisconsin kind of compares to some nationally or regionally other states?
I think just in very gross terms, if you look at the lower end of the income scale in Wisconsin, typically going to be more favorable. So up to maybe $50,000 a year for a couple, going to be more favorable in Wisconsin than the national average. On the upper end, less favorable in Wisconsin in terms of the effective tax rate. If you look at just the nominal tax rate for our highest tax bracket would be 8th highest in the country, 2nd highest among our several neighboring states. But obviously, you still have at the lower end pretty favorable rates in Wisconsin, and for that first section of income, everybody is going to get that more favorable rate until you get into the upper income levels.
Anytime you're talking about a tax cut, the question is, okay, how much money is the state potentially losing? And it's a very different story here with these two plans, isn't it?
Right, absolutely. Because Evers' plan includes both tax cuts and uppers. It's going to be roughly flat, tiny bit of a decrease overall for state revenues. Under the Republican plan, it'd be very substantial decreases once it's fully phased in under 4 years. We're talking more than $4 billion, which would, make sustaining current levels of public services challenging.
And you kind of mentioned that Evers' plan has a lot of provisions and it makes it a little bit more complicated than maybe the flat tax as far as when you're doing your research and trying to figure out the exact economic impact. Is some of that still in flux based off of what happens over the next couple of years?
I mean, absolutely, I think just within the state capital, very in flux about what we're going to ultimately end up on. And both the Evers and the LeMahieu plans, I think, pretty clearly are not going to be the final proposal that passes. We'll have to see what comes out. But I think what you see clearly is the fight is over the people at the upper end and how to handle those filers. So I think that is clearly where the battle lines are drawn.
You mentioned this could be a while as they battle this out. Do you see similarities to when you look at what the tax battle was a couple of years ago when they were going through this?
It's interesting. I think the real question is, 2 years ago, you had a more than roughly $1 billion tax cut that Evers ultimately signed. I think somewhat to the surprise of Republican leaders. I think they had thought that he might veto that. And now the question is going to be, again, he has a powerful partial veto pen. Can he take whatever state budget gets passed to him by Republican leaders and modify it to his liking? Maybe even negotiate with them beforehand? Or, are they going to fail to come to an agreement? He would veto the entire budget in that scenario, and we would be, kind of in uncharted territory. I guess he could also just simply veto the tax plan in its entirety and then just negotiate with them over that going forward.
Cutting taxes is always very popular, and with the state surplus, is there a little bit of danger, though, that you go too far here? You mentioned you could have an unbalanced budget if you go too much here with the tax cuts, correct?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that also applies to some of the really substantial spending increases that Evers has included in his budget. I mean, right now we have total state reserves of almost $9 billion. That sets us up very nicely for the next 2 years. It's unprecedented to see something like that. But when you look out 3, 4, 5 years, and some of these Republican plans would go that far out to fully phase in, then right, it's an absolute, it's a question, number one, what will the economy be? What will our needs be as a state? And do we have what we can sustainably move forward with?
As you mentioned, neither one of these plans will probably pass, but it's always interesting to see where are they starting right in this battleground. I want to thank you so much for the research that you did and explaining it to us here today. Thank you so much.